Well, I thought I might tell you something of my story about how this unfolded, this journey that brings me to this point today. And when I look back at it over time, I see that the ordinary can become extraordinary, that I view myself as an ordinary person who was getting on with my life and doing things that were important to me. But that was who I was, just an ordinary person, as we all are in our own way. And I think we all have the ability to be lifted into that other space that asks the extraordinary of us. I think that's just the way. And we can walk that if we're prepared to do it just one step at a time. Because I don't believe the universe asks us to take giant leaps into the nothingness, a disastrous space. So I begin way back in those early days when I was drawn to the world of Māori, and I was actually 30 years old and shifted from teaching, accepting a position in a school of education, a place for training secondary teachers. For all of our nation, there were only 2 such training schools in New Zealand. Mine was in the South Island in Christchurch Teachers College, and we received graduates from the history departments throughout the various universities when they'd finished their degrees. We might make them into teachers, help them along the way. But of course they have to practice, they have to go into schools. You don't do this in a lecture room. You have to be with children. And early on I realised that we were training them for all of New Zealand, but if they stayed in the South Island they would see very few Māori children. So along with a Māori colleague of mine who was heading up the Māori Studies Department, we had a plan. And the plan was to send my students into the North Island to very remote places, the little Māori schools, that they might learn to teach others, to cross the cultures, to equip themselves to be of greater service to all our children. And the first time I made a journey into the north, I was truly amazed by what I found. It was really quite a sobering experience. And when I came into a place called Te Kaha, a little place on the east coast of the North Island, something happened that changed my life. After spending the day in the school with my student, I was in the local pub, the hotel, only place to stay. And I was having a quiet beer with a young Māori who was on leave from the Navy. He'd come home for a few days. And we were talking, and it was just lovely to be with him. Then after my meal, I gathered round with others and they were playing pool. And they were playing what's called King of the Table. So the person who just won the last game gets challenged and you work in pairs. So I got paired up with an old Māori man called Rusty. And we were a great team because I had a pool table at home and I had plenty of practice, and he'd been round for a long time, and we held the table for an hour or two, quietly meeting each challenge. And it was getting late into the night when I was trying to make a very difficult shot. And he came up beside me and he suddenly said, as I was trying to push the cue through, "Tell me, bloody professor, what are you doing for Māori children?" And I was stunned. I missed the ball completely. I put the cue down on the table and I looked round and he was gone. And I thought we were friends. I thought we'd made some kind of connection in all that time. And then, within a moment, the young Māori man from the Navy, who was home on leave, he said, "Don't move, don't go away, he's paid you a huge compliment." He said, "He's over there getting a beer, just wait." Well, when Rusty had made that comment, it was so sharp it had gone right through the gathering. There was this incredible silence. People were waiting to see what I would do. So on his advice, I just waited, and Rusty came along and he just kind of nodded, and I went with him over to a little table. We sat there together and he poured me a glass of beer, and then he sat there and wept. Tears flowed. And when he was ready, he said, "I just had to say something. What are you doing for our Māori children? I weep for your children, and I weep for mine. I weep for our future. What are you doing for Māori children?" And it spun me around. I just felt his pain, I felt his tears. And I didn't really have an answer for him then. I mean, I'd made this step of sending students into this remote place. I was trying to do something, but I realized it was only a start, it wasn't enough. When I look back on it, I remember the words of elders who in later times said, "Rusty shot a dart into your heart." And it was true. It struck you deep, changed your life. I kept in touch with that school, but I never met Sandy again. Whenever I wrote a new book, I sent one off for their library. But of course, that wasn't what it was all about. It was about where my journey went from there, what I might do for all our children. So it was a few years later, just 2 or 3, that a colleague and myself, we came to a special project we wanted to see through. See, the way we were teaching our students had a kind of catchy title. It was History with Boots On. That's what we called it, being out there. I realized after a short time in this training institution that so many of our history students came along thinking that history was something that happened in the library. And it didn't, of course. It's about real people walking through real events in real time and carrying all that meant to them as mothers and fathers and children. So I wanted our students to go out into the land, to step back into history and walk those events into the land itself, to be there with their boots on.